The book is better than the movies. You've probably heard that line over and over again. But get ready because you're going to hear it even more. If you're watching this video, you probably agree though. The Harry Potter books are much better than the movies. But today, let's look at the differences and the changes that were made between the two. From Ron's character getting turned into a complete idiot, to cut plot lines and missing characters. The movies made a lot of changes. Some good, some questionable, and some pretty bad. But before we get started, take a moment to click that subscribe button and the bell to get more content about your favorite fictional series. I'd love to make it to 10,000 subscribers, and we're making great progress. Let me know in the comments if you have ideas for me to cover, and I'll add them to the list. Without further ado, this is the Harry Potter Movie Changes Iceberg Explained. As always, let's start off with level 1. Ron is useless. Honestly, I don't think I could possibly start this iceberg off any other way than to talk about the changes made to Ron's character. Those of you that are familiar with the books, which I'm guessing is most of you if you're watching this, probably found Ron to be one of your favorite characters. That is, until you saw him on screen, transformed into the butt of every joke and the comic relief of every scene. Now, don't get me wrong, Ron is one of my favorite characters, even in the movies, but there are so many details that were removed from his storyline or outright given to his friends, seemingly in an effort to flesh out other characters or make Ron better fit for the comic relief role. Let's briefly touch on a couple glaring issues that book readers will remember well, starting with the ending of the first book, Philosopher's Stone. We find the trio dropping through the trapdoor under Fluffy directly into the Devil's Snare, the plant from hell. Here's the scene from the book, where we find Hermione panicking. Hermione Granger says, Devil's Snare, what did Professor Sprout say? It likes the dark and the damp. Harry then says, so light a fire. Hermione says, yes, of course, but there's no wood. To which Ron replies, have you gone mad? Are you a witch or not? To which Hermione says, oh, right. So we have this scene where the trio acts collaboratively. Hermione brings book smarts, Harry brings bravery or whatever, and Ron brings some common sense. But when we get to the movies, Harry and Hermione calmly slip through the Devil's Snare, while Ron flails around like a moron, only to have Hermione save him. One more example that is more frustrating than anything. Skip ahead to The Prisoner of Azkaban, when everyone is in the shack beneath the Whomping Willow. Ron and Hermione don't yet know Sirius Black's intentions and are worried for Harry's life. In the book, Ron makes a statement saying, quote, if you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too, end quote. It's a small scene, but it adds quite a bit to Ron's character as a brave and loyal friend. In the movie, we again find that line given to Hermione. Overall, Ron's character is so dumbed down in the movies, it's sometimes quite frustrating to watch. That said, he's still one of my favorite characters. I'll leave you with a Reddit comment I found that summarizes basically what I think most of us felt. Quote, you know who I love in the books? Ron. Fantastic character, funny, comes up with good ideas, a little short-tempered, kind of thick, but no more thick than Harry at times. You know who I hate in the movies? Ron. Comic relief character, barely funny, literally just an idiot every film, and every good idea he had in the books was given to Hermione. Really, really stupid. They just ruined Ron's character in the movies is all. Frowny emoji. End quote. McGonagall observing the Dursleys. While I was working on my last Harry Potter iceberg, I came across this tiny detail that you might barely remember. In the opening sequence of the movie, we find Dumbledore arriving at the Dursleys with McGonagall and Hagrid. A short scene ensues where McGonagall is essentially complaining to Dumbledore that the Dursleys are the worst type of Muggle, a family beyond redemption. In the movies, there's not a whole lot of context to this. Why does Professor McGonagall know about the Dursleys? Is she familiar with them through a connection with Lily and James Potter? In reality, it's all based on a couple scenes that are entirely omitted from the movies. These scenes detail McGonagall scoping out the Dursleys prior to Dumbledore's arrival. Here's the scene from the book. Quote, "It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he'd seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats can't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind." End quote. Honestly, I'm a little surprised this wasn't included in the movies somehow. It's a comical scene that introduces some of the mystery of the wizarding world. I suppose they just had to start with Dumbledore. It's a much more compelling story, and there's no way they'd start the entire movie series with the Dursleys, but it does provide a little more context to why McGonagall was against sending Harry to a bad home in the first place. Priori Incantatem. Okay, on to one issue that I found to be most glaring between the book and the movie: the manner in which duels are portrayed. Specifically, the way spells cast by two combatants interact with one another. In the books, a phrase that I'm probably going to say 100 more times in this video, spells simply do not connect with each other. There is a single instance where two cast spells interact with each other in a sort of reverse tug-of-war. Only in the graveyard at the end of the Triwizard Tournament do Harry and Voldemort's spells collide. Their twin Phoenix Feather Core wands dueling each other in a completely unique experience. We see the spells meet in the middle, turn golden, and fight back and forth. Voldemort's wand eventually overpowered by Harry's. Switch over to the movies, and I swear every other scene shows two spells meeting in the middle and pushing back and forth. And it's not only Harry and Voldemort. Even characters like Arthur Weasley are briefly shown having a priori incantatem experience against a random Death Eater. Now, I will note the only difference here is that we don't see the reverse spell thing happen like what happens with Harry and Voldemort, but we do see the spells meet in the middle, something that I don't think happens in the books. Now, I know the answer is pretty obvious. This effect is something that the movies use to add some flash and pizzazz to magical duels. It seems as though they stumbled across this dueling spell effect in Book 4 and then proceeded to use it in every instance possible. But that said, this effect, the response of two brother wands dueling, is supposed to be unique to Harry and Voldemort, and even more specifically, to their two Phoenix wands. With the effect included so commonly, you start to lose track of its purpose, even if you've read the books. In my humble opinion, this is the most annoying type of change that can be made from book to movie. It doesn't really add anything to the plot, and in fact, leaves movie viewers confused about how wands and magic work in the first place, all in favor of some flashy CGI. I'm sure I'm not alone here. Did any of you find this one particularly annoying? Did you have to explain it to your friends at the risk of being the one kid that always said, well, actually, in the books? Regulus Black's story. Regulus Black's storyline is one that I'm not entirely surprised was cut down to a couple lines in the movies, but at the same time, it seems like it's a little bit of a shame. It adds quite a bit of tragedy to Kreacher, the Black's house elf, who otherwise might just seem like an ornery old house elf. In reality, he's a house elf that's been abused, tortured, almost murdered, and then eventually shown some respect, first by Regulus, and then later by Harry and his crew. I'd also forgive you if you didn't really remember Regulus's storyline from the books either. He was the one who initially stole Voldemort's locket with the help of Kreacher, replacing it with a fake one along the way. The same fake that Harry later retrieves with Dumbledore. It's such an interesting little side story that, although it doesn't really change the plotline all that much, it basically just moves the locket from one place to another, eventually ending up with Dolores Umbridge. It does flesh out the Black family in a way we don't see much of. Regulus was a Death Eater, yes, But people often refer to him as the good Death Eater, one that died while attempting to make Voldemort mortal. Ultimately, I can see how in a 2-hour movie, it would be hard to include him in a meaningful way. But we do miss out on seeing that Sirius isn't the only member of his family who fought on the right side of history. There was, of course, Tonks, who showed up in the last couple movies. I think she would have been the second cousin of Sirius, first cousin removed. I'm not sure how that works. Regardless, you forget sometimes that so many of these characters are related in some way. I mean, technically, Draco is Sirius Black's cousin as well. Honestly, it seems like that family tree is to blame for many of the issues in the wizarding world. Quirrell's interactions with Harry. If I asked you to describe Professor Quirrell, there would probably be a single part of his physical description that none of you would forget: his turban. But there is a fascinating little change that happened in the movie that also seemed to dictate how Quirrell interacted with Harry. You see, when we're introduced to Quirrell in the books, he's not wearing a turban. Harry first meets him on his first ever trip to Diagon Alley. Hagrid opens the door to a little pub where they will enter Diagon Alley through the bricks in the back. But just a second, I want to pause, because the pub that Hagrid enters seems to be incredibly public, and inside it's filled with witches and wizards. Maybe there's a simple explanation for how muggles wouldn't find this place. I have to imagine random people might stumble upon it, and Hagrid pretty much announces to the whole room that he's there on Hogwarts business. The whole thing is not very secretive, it seems. But anyways, they enter this pub, and I believe this is the first time we see Quirrell. He's standing in the pub, muttering to himself, presumably conversing with Voldemort in the corner. But this is also an interesting problem, because Quirrell should not have Voldemort on the back of his head at this point. He hasn't tried to rob Gringotts, so Voldemort hasn't been compelled to possess and live on the back of his head. There really isn't a reason for him to be wearing a turban at this point in the movie. But we continue, quote, "Harry Potter, can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you." That's my Quirrell impression. Hagrid introduces Harry, and Harry stretches out his hand to shake Quirrell's, which in the books he reciprocates, shaking the Chosen One's hand. But the Quirrell in the movies refuses, seemingly nervous about touching or even being around Harry. Obviously, if you ever finished the first book, or the movie, you know that Harry touching Quirrell while Voldemort was possessing him is what ends up killing him. Or rather, I think it's actually because when Harry touches Quirrell, it's injuring Voldemort, which causes Voldemort to flee Quirrell's body, and that's what kills him? Not sure. I could use some input here in the comments. The only problem is both Quirrell and Voldemort are surprised by Harry's magic touch at the end of the first school year. So when Quirrell refuses to shake Harry's hand, he doesn't really have a reason. Even if the timeline was flipped and he already had Voldemort on the back of his head, it still wouldn't make any sense. Although that would have been a hilarious way for Harry's first year to start. He shakes Quirrell's hand, kills him on the spot, and then the Curb Your Enthusiasm music plays while they roll the credits. Scene. Now, let's get to some even trickier changes to spot in Level 2. Character changes. Some of these have to be a little more fun, so let's talk about the physical changes that the movie made to the characters, and the reasons behind those changes. First and foremost is the description of Harry, specifically his eyes. Now, in the books, he's described as having green eyes, and there are two obvious reasons for this. One, the more heartfelt but sometimes creepy one, is that his mother had green eyes, something that Snape very clearly latches onto in the way that only an obsessive person might. But the other reason, I believe, is to be a reference and foreshadowing about the piece of Voldemort's soul that's contained within him. That said, Voldemort's soul, or a piece of it rather, does not enter Harry's body until he's a year old. Now, before you freak out, I know that Voldemort's eyes are described as red and snake-like in the books, not green, and also that Tom Riddle's eyes were described as dark brown, also not green. But I do still think it's some sort of allusion maybe to Slytherin or just the idea of Voldemort and Slytherin, and yeah, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts below. So we see all this importance placed on the color of Harry's eyes, and yet when we get to the movies, his eyes are blue. What the heck? Well, there is a very simple answer. As it turns out, Daniel Radcliffe had an adverse reaction to the colored contacts he was supposed to be wearing, so he simply couldn't, meaning Harry's eyes had to be the same color as Daniel Radcliffe's eyes. There is one small Easter egg where in the final scene where the gang is saying goodbye to each other, you can see Harry's eyes look a bit bloodshot. It was actually the first scene that was filmed for the movie, and the moment they realized that Radcliffe wouldn't be able to wear the contacts for the whole film. His eyes had been irritated by them for the filming of that scene. Here's the quote from the producer, David Heyman. Quote, "I'll never forget being on set that first day, filming the last scene of Philosopher's Stone, where Hagrid and Harry bid farewell at the railway station at Hogsmeade. Dan Radcliffe was wearing these contact lenses to make his eyes green, and he had an allergic reaction to them. His eyes were red and swollen, and we had to take them out. We thought we may add that green digitally, though ultimately we decided not to because it felt artificial. But Dan's eyes were puffy and red, and oddly, it was quite appropriate for the scene where he was saying goodbye to Hagrid." End quote. In that same scene, you might notice something else about Hermione. Obviously, in the books, we have Hermione being described as a somewhat more average-looking girl, potentially a pretty awkward-looking one, with bushy hair and buck teeth. The movies tried to capture that initially, giving Emma Watson a set of prosthetic teeth, but after realizing again that they would be too cumbersome to wear for the entire movie, and potentially the entire series, they opted out of them. You can still see them in the final goodbye scene. It's very subtle, so I can see why the tiny change in her appearance was not worth making Emma Watson uncomfortable for the next decade of filming. Marauder's origins. If you've read the books, this piece of information is probably so familiar to you that you might not believe the fact that the Marauders, or at least their origins, are not really explained in the movies. The audience is left trying to puzzle together the pieces and connect dots from earlier movies that are never really explicitly connected. Yes, we do see James, Sirius, Remus, and Peter hanging out, but mostly torturing Snape, but there isn't really a whole lot that connects them to the other pieces of lore surrounding the Marauders. The Marauders' map, their code names, why they are animagus in the first place. Honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you saw the Marauders' map in the first movie and thought it was an ancient magical tool, just like the Cloak of Invisibility that was created centuries ago with some ancient magic. But no, it was a tool created by the four friends with the express purpose of aiding in their sneaking about the castle, primarily to help Remus Lupin during his full moon episodes. The other part that is entirely omitted from the movies is the importance and backstory of the Shrieking Shack. That is, the tiny shack found with the secret tunnel leading to it underneath the Whomping Willow. In the movie, there really isn't any context provided around the shack. Why do they end up here in the first place? In the movie, it seems like an almost entirely random set piece that just happens to be under an angry animated tree. While, if you paid attention while reading the novel, you'll know that the Shrieking Shack was actually built specifically for Lupin as a place where he could go to safely transform into a werewolf so that no one around him would be injured. The Shrieking Shack actually did not have in any way in or out except for through the Whomping Willow, specifically designed that way in order to keep out prying eyes and stop any werewolf accidents from happening. All of this is left out in the movies, including the fact that Snape shows up there with no possible explanation for how he knew of where to find the shack, at least not in the movies. In the books, Sirius basically almost got him killed by trying to send him to the shack while Lupin was transforming. That's the reason Snape has history with the shack and knows how to get into it without a smashing from the tree standing guard. Overall, a strange omission from the movie for something that would have taken maybe 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. Instead, 7 movies later, if you haven't read the books, you still don't know who the Marauders were. Ravenclaw crest. This is a quick one that I also covered in a recent video. Do you know what the animal on the Ravenclaw crest is? Go ahead and guess together on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. That's right. An eagle. Wait, what? Well, there's actually 2 different answers here. In the novels, the Ravenclaw crest includes the image of an eagle, talons splayed against a blue and bronze background. Switch over to the movies, however, and you'll find something a little more on the nose, or on the beak, I guess. Instead of an eagle, you'll find a raven, and instead of the original blue and bronze colors, you'll find blue and silver. This seems to be a change that really upsets people for some reason. I think it probably has to do with how on the nose the raven is. I mean, we have Gryffindor, but their symbol is a lion, not necessarily a griffin. We have Slytherin, which is obviously a snake. I'm not sure what else it really could be. And lastly, we have, of course, our friends in Hufflepuff, which I don't have the faintest idea why their crest involves a badger. I've read that badgers are hardworking and loyal, but I'm not really sure how you make a decision on how one animal is harder working than another animal. I guess they're all pretty hardworking. Wingardium Leviosa. I'm not actually sure if I said that correctly, but there are actually 2 separate corrections to make here regarding this levitating spell. One, a change that was made in the movies, and one that's just a misinterpretation of a thick English accent. First, the misinterpretation. We all know the scene. Ron says the spell incorrectly, and Hermione says, "Stop, stop, stop. You're going to take someone's eye out. Besides, you're saying it wrong. It's Leviosa, not Leviosa." But here's the thing. She's correcting not only the enunciation of Ron's spell, but actually the word as well. Ron, or rather Rupert Grint, to be clear, is saying Leviosar with an R, which is what Hermione is correcting. You just can't tell if you're not listening for the accent. But now to the change. There is a tiny, tiny change that makes me wonder how they even came up with Hermione correcting something else in the movies. See, in the movies, Hermione is correcting the second word, Leviosa. In the books, Hermione is actually correcting the first word, Wingardium. The text from the chapter goes like this. Ron, at the next table, wasn't having much more luck. "Wingardium Leviosa," he shouted, waving his long arms like a windmill. "You're saying it wrong," Harry heard Hermione snap. "It's Wingardium Leviosa. Make the gar nice and long. You do it then, if you're so clever," Ron snarled. Hermione rolled up the sleeves of her gown, flicked her wand, and said, Wingardium Leviosa. My best guess is that the change was made to make the audience feel as though the difference between the 2 words was even more slight, almost a pedantic change, rather than one that should actually matter. If I think back to how the audience was made to feel about Hermione at that point in the movies, I do think they were intended to find her slightly annoying. But Ron's mocking directly after class guilts the viewer, as Ron has clearly hurt her feelings. The book doesn't mention exactly how Ron is mocking her after class, only that he wasn't in a good mood. The movies are the ones that really give life to the scene and start to form the basis of an inseparable trio for the rest of the series. Durmstrang and Beauxbaton. You would be forgiven if you didn't realize this was actually changed for the movies. Enter Goblet of Fire, the 4th year of Harry's schooling, and seemingly the only movie that's ever on during the holiday season. I swear, I never see any of the other movies during that time of the year. It's always Goblet of Fire. The Triwizard Tournament rolls around, and that's the first one they've had in quite some time, and with it arrive students and representatives from Durmstrang and Beauxbaton. Now, this is actually a very minor change, and one that's barely even a noticeable difference from the books, at least not at the time that they came out. In the books, we see one of the Durmstrang students, Polyakov. They see Harry Potter and point him out to an unnamed girl next to him. From my understanding, that seems to be the only evidence we have of a girl at Durmstrang from the Goblet of Fire book. That said, We have since found out through later interviews and movies that the founder of Durmstrang was actually a woman. It stands to reason, then, that a woman would probably not ban girls from attending the school in the future. The counterpoint here seems to be that it is possible that a future headmaster of the school enacted a change that led it to be an all-boys school. It seems more likely to me that in the making of the movie, Durmstrang was changed to an all-boys school to make their appearance more like that of a boys' military academy. Gruff and precise, less of a school, more of an army. This would make it easier to convey emotions and themes to young audiences. On to the Beauxbatons. This is a similar situation to the Durmstrang girl. There were several male students noted in the book to be in attendance. However, once we get to the movies, all of this is removed and simplified down to an all-female school. Notably, Nicholas Flamel, the wizard responsible for creating the Philosopher's Stone, was a Beauxbaton student. Again, all of this is likely just a simplification made during the movie to make for a more striking comparison. But it's also interesting that even though the novels make a point to say that the schools are not single gender, they don't really go out of their way to show it in a manner that would make you think it's a 50-50 split. So honestly, I don't really blame the movies for simplifying things. But let's continue on to some even more interesting departures the movie made from the book in Level 3. Harry's Walk to Death. I actually had to go back and reread this chapter to better understand the differences in how this appeared in the books and how it was shown in the movies. Let's start out with the scene and how it's written in the books. Many fans will point to it as some of the best writing in the series. The chapter starts with Harry lying on the ground, contemplating and slowly accepting the course that the remaining hour of his life must take. It is, in fact, less than an hour, as Voldemort has given him that much time to turn himself over, and Harry has stated that more than 30 minutes have already gone by. He slowly comes to accept the reality of his situation, of the way Dumbledore has used him in a broader plan, of the fact that there will still be unfinished business after his death, that someone else will have to finish off both Nagini and Voldemort, and that his life will have to end before the final blow can be dealt to Voldemort. He also resolves himself to go silently. He puts on the invisibility cloak and begins walking out of the castle, stopping only to give Neville a few instructions about Nagini. Notably, he purposely does not go to Ron and Hermione to say goodbye. I'm sure he knows that they wouldn't let him sacrifice himself, just as the trio has always found another way in the first 6 years of the series. There must be another way this time as well. But Harry knows better, and he understands that he must sacrifice himself for his friends and, really, the entirety of the wizarding world. He makes his way out to the Forbidden Forest, his heart described as a funeral drum. It's a haunting walk that he makes towards death, and the reader shares in this experience. You are left feeling like you're making this journey with Harry. I mean, remember, no one really knew what was going to happen when the book came out. We really didn't know that Harry would come back to life. We assumed that he would be there somehow, but there was a real chance that this would actually be the end of Harry Potter. Now, we move over to the movies, and the scene all happens a bit differently. Rather than Harry sneaking out of the castle without a word to anyone except Neville, Ron and Hermione find him walking down the stairs on his way out, and predictably attempt to stop him. Harry then goes on to explain to Hermione, Ron, and presumably the audience, that he is the final Horcrux that needs to be destroyed. The scene is still a good one, but I do think it loses a lot of the tension that's present in the book. The directors are faced with a hard task, though. The books show this all through internal dialogue. Harry's just thinking through all of this, something that would be quite difficult or strange to show in a movie. So, while I'm sure this was a change that was partly so that we could see the trio have a farewell scene, I think it's also so that Harry can explain to the audience, very explicitly, why he has to go to the woods and sacrifice himself. Admittedly, they don't exactly explain why he has to sacrifice himself willingly, But they do explain that Harry is a Horcrux. Harry leaves telling Ron and Hermione to, quote, kill the snake and then it's just him, end quote. I'm curious what you all think of this change. Acceptable? Terrible? Mediocre? Let me know in the comments. And if you've made it this far, why don't you click that subscribe button? Polyjuice Potion. We are first introduced to the Polyjuice Potion in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And with it, we're given a few pretty funny scenes where Harry and Ron have to pretend to be Crabbe and Goyle. In the movies, when they transform into the Slytherin sidekicks, their voices do not make that same transformation. Harry tells Ron, quote, we still sound like ourselves. You need to sound more like Crabbe, end quote. After which they have to alter their voices, using Crabbe and Goyle accents to match the boys that they're impersonating. We also find Hermione has accidentally transformed into a cat, rather than to another Slytherin girl. But Polyjuice potions work a little differently in the books. They're actually a full transformation, including the transformation of the voice. I believe this actually was a problem in the Wizarding War because of how difficult it was to spot a fake. You see a hint of this during the Battle of Seven Potters, where Harry's not immediately believed to be the actual Harry Potter. He's pinned against a wall and forced to prove it. So Polyjuice potions have a bit of a more nefarious purpose when they're not being used by school children. Additionally, it's a bit confusing when you watch the other movies, as the effect seems to be pretty inconsistent in the movies. For instance, when you move to the third movie, and we find Mad-Eye Moody being impersonated by Barty Crouch Jr., his voice has obviously changed. I would guess that the reason behind this is twofold. One, that this is how the potion is supposed to work. But two, having the actors constantly have to voice over the performance with an impersonated version of Moody's voice would have been really difficult to do. It also wouldn't have made any sense to the watcher, and it really would have given away the fake immediately. If you think about it, there are very few people that could do a convincing enough accent that you wouldn't question it. And if you were in the wizarding world and knew of the existence of a Polyjuice potion, a bad accent would be an immediate giveaway. So, really, the potion doesn't really make any sense at all unless the voice also changes with the appearance, something that the movie is not very clear on. Ginny's character. I'll be honest, I don't remember much about Ginny's character in the books, and that said, I remember even less about Ginny from the movies. Apart, of course, from some of the most awkward scenes ever recorded and forced on an audience. But I think to many people, this was one of the movie's greatest crimes. The way that Ginny was changed from a much more outgoing character to a timid girl that didn't really seem to add much to the story, apart from having Harry fall in love with his best friend's sister. In the books, Ginny is a confident, strong character. She has wit and charm, and refuses to be subjugated as the younger sister of a bunch of older brothers. She's got a passion for Quidditch in the books that isn't really explored all that much in the movies, and is forced to turn into this awkward character that interacts with Harry for a few scenes without really adding anything to the plot. I would guess a few things are going on here. First, movies always have to cut down on different characters and plot lines. There simply isn't room to do it all. But secondly, it seems like all of Harry's love interest plot lines are just perfectly engineered to be awkward. And I'm not sure if this was in part due to Daniel Radcliffe, or if the showrunners had a very different idea. I think they knew that they had the relationship between Harry, Ron, and Hermione to compete with, as well as the eventual romance between Ron and Hermione. And so they were forced to add some kind of relationship for Harry into the mix because it's part of the book, while also having to have the point of his character be to fight Voldemort. Honestly, I think it's just a case of picking and choosing different plot lines. Harry already has the entire movie dedicated to him. Maybe they were forced to sacrifice some of his relationship with Ginny in order to focus on a few other developing plot lines with the 2 hours of runtime they were given. I don't know. It seems like maybe they just had it out for the Weasleys. First Ron, then Ginny, Fred and George got a lot of airtime, but other Weasley family members were just cut entirely. The poor Weasleys. Missing characters. On the topic of changed and cut characters, there are many, but let's just touch on a few that were interesting. First, we have Charles Weasley, the second oldest Weasley child, the one known for working with dragons. We do have a few mentions of him by name, but he's cut entirely from his brother's wedding later in the movie series, despite being the best man in the books. This is likely just the nature of the Weasleys having 7 kids. There's just no way to include them all. But instead, we're left with the parents, Ron, a half-hearted Ginny, Fred and George, a few scenes with Percy, the nerd prefect, Bill almost becoming a werewolf, and that's about it. It seems like there could have been maybe a middle ground. On to another cut character that really surprised me, and it also seems like it surprised the actor. Peeves. Peeves was the poltergeist that haunted Hogwarts, causing mischief and mayhem for all the students and professors alike. Interestingly, they not only cast an actor to play Peeves, but even filmed all of his parts, only for the actor to find out while watching the movie that all those scenes had been cut. Lastly, one more interesting character that was cut. Bertha Jorkins, a seemingly forgettable character, but one that's instrumental in both the return of Voldemort and the creation of a Horcrux. Bertha is convinced to stroll out into the woods with Peter Pettigrew and is eventually interrogated and murdered by Voldemort. He uses this murder to turn Nagini into a Horcrux. This seems like a strangely absent character and plotline, as I can imagine it being a pretty dark scene. It would have fit into the tone of the 4th movie, but maybe it was just a touch too dark to include at the time. It would have had to happen early during the film, so maybe it would have just spoiled the setup for the climactic battle in the graveyard. I'm not totally sure. I'm sure there are other missing characters that I didn't talk about here, and I just didn't have time, so they were cut twice. Let me know in the comments what your favorite cut characters were, though. And while you're typing, let's move down to level 4. Death Eaters apparating. Here's another minor change that I included in my last video, but because it seems to be movie-specific, I'm including it here as well. It has to do with the way that we see Death Eaters move around, specifically when we see them with black plumes of smoke trailing them. I wasn't really able to find any evidence of a similar phenomenon in the books, so from what I can tell, it is in fact unique to the movies. It's also not exactly clear what they're doing. A lot of people claim this is a visual representation of a Death Eater apparating somewhere, but this seems like a strange claim to me, as we see apparating happen with other characters. In the books, it's often described as instantaneous. In the movies, it also appears to happen just as quickly. The character, or characters, that disapparate basically fold in upon themselves and disappear, and then when they reappear, it happens in an instant, not with a trail of black smoke coming down. So, all in all, I'm not sure that I buy it that it's some sort of apparating. I instead think it's actually the Death Eaters flying around on a broomstick, but they just also put off a plume of black smoke as a visual differentiator. On top of this, I doubt that Death Eaters are performing unsupported flight. We see this described as an incredibly difficult skill to master, one that only Voldemort and Snape are shown having done. That said, it's possible the movies just gave these abilities to all the Death Eaters, because it's the same effect we see when Snape is ousted by McGonagall in the Deathly Hallows. Snape clearly doesn't have a broom, but he still turns into a plume of black smoke and flies away. So it could be the same thing that other Death Eaters are doing, and they just gave the powers to all of them, which is kind of annoying because it sort of lessens the effect and the skill required to do this, but again, they shortened things for the movies, and I think they made it a little bit less complicated to begin with. Who knows? Maybe I'm just overthinking all of this. Rita Skeeter, unregistered animagus. That was a mouthful. Anyways, Rita Skeeter is not an incredibly important character in the series. She appears in The Goblet of Fire, but only in a few passing scenes, and never in a way that's all that important to the plot, at least in the movies. She does a few interviews with the competitors, but ultimately, the scandal in the Daily Prophet is not a plotline that ends up being all that important in The Goblet of Fire. The movies also don't always have the luxury of wrapping things up after the climax for several chapters. So if there isn't time to wrap up a plotline like Rita Skeeter as an unregistered animagus, it probably shouldn't be included in the first place. Like so many other items on the list, Rita Skeeter is just one of many that probably had to be cut down or removed entirely to make the series fit into a feature-length film. If you read the books, there was time and space for all these side characters to exist and to be explored. That's what you lose when you move to a movie format. I feel as though some people had a strange amount of love for Rita Skeeter as a character. I'm not totally sure where that comes from. I certainly didn't. I have read that people think Rita is a self-insert for J.K. Rowling, in which case I can kind of understand the love for the character, but otherwise, she never seemed all that impactful to me. Let me know in the comments if I'm way off base here and she was more important than I'm remembering. Invisibility cloak usage. If you remember back to the first movie, you probably remember the first time Harry used the cloak to sneak around the castle. You probably remember him going into the restricted section of the library and opening up a book that screamed at him. That moment is burned into my memory. Harry's scouring the restricted section looking for information on Nicholas Flamel. He opens a book that has a face inside that pops out and starts screaming, leading to him hiding from Filch. We'll get back to the Cloak of Invisibility in a second, but what's interesting to me is that people seem to have very different reasons for why the book is screaming. I guess I always assumed it had to do with the content of the book itself, that the screaming head was actually part of whatever chapter Harry opened the book to. The book contained some sort of terrifying knowledge, including some soul that was trying to escape, something like that. That said, when I was looking this up, the opinion seems to be split, and many others seem to believe that the screaming book was actually some sort of alarm trigger, and that all of the books in the restricted section would have done the same thing. That was actually the first time I'd ever heard that. Let me know down below what you thought was happening with that book. Anyways, back to the cloak. If it seems in the novels that Harry uses the cloak way more often and for many other purposes, you'd be right. Harry simply does not use his cloak as often in the movies as he does in the books. That might be for several reasons, but I think at the core of it is the idea that watching Harry under the cloak is not very compelling for a viewer. It's a bit like a cheat code for him. That's when I came across some very good reasoning. J.K. Rowling essentially uses the cloak for one reason: exposition. It allows Harry to experience certain events without being part of them. It eliminates the need to have the event recapped the following day by another character. Instead, Harry, and by extension the reader, can see it all happen firsthand. The only problem is that when it comes to filming a movie, it's not all that interesting. You can't just have Harry hiding under a cloak in every scene. But this is a rare case where the movies can do something that the books chose not to do. That is, switching points of view. Instead of only following along Harry for the journey, the movie is able to make the viewer a fly on the wall, observing scenes that Harry otherwise should not have been able to. So, all in all, I think it's a pretty good trade-off to make. The invisibility cloak is cool at first, but I feel like the novelty would wear off pretty quickly if Harry used it in every opportunity that came up. Harry never goes to class. Here's another change that was probably for the better. When we first join Harry at Hogwarts, his first year is actually full of quite a few classes. It's really the way that we're introduced to most of the professor characters. But as time goes on, and Harry enters his later years at the school, the movies tend to stop showcasing his classes apart from Defense Against the Dark Arts, and the occasional potions class with Snape. But that's sort of the key, isn't it? We end up seeing much more of the characters that matter. Almost every year has some sort of weird incident involving the defense against the dark arts professor, and Snape obviously becomes one of the most important characters in the entire series. It only makes sense that the movies would choose to focus on the characters that actually mattered. To extend this, it seems to me like there are a lot of areas where the movies just felt less magical to me. The first movie does a good job at capturing a lot of the character of the castle, the moving staircases, the trap doors, the forbidden forest. I feel like as the movies went on, it became less of a magical world and more of a normal school that Harry went to that happened to have wands and magic in it. Maybe this is just one way of portraying how it was all new to Harry at the start, and as he grew up, some of the quote-unquote magic faded. Let me know if I'm alone in this feeling. And while you're doing that, let's head down to our fifth and final level, level 5. Snake Incident. Let's break up the serious topics with one lighthearted one. When we see Harry visit the zoo in one of the opening scenes, we see him magically vanish the glass, which results in the escape of the boa constrictor. But there is a key difference that splits off at this point. In the books, Dudley doesn't actually fall into the exhibit. He and his friend jump back in shock. Harry has vanished the glass, allowing the boa constrictor to escape and supposedly try to go back to Brazil somehow. But Dudley and his friend do not fall into the exhibit. Directly after this, the zoo director is seen apologizing to the Dursleys, asking over and over where the glass went. He's asking himself. Of course, in the movies, it's not exactly the case. Harry vanishes the glass, the boa constrictor escapes, and Dudley, present without his friends this time, falls through the opening and into the exhibit. Then the glass reappears and Dudley is trapped, leading to some of the early iconic scenes of the series. Overall, I'd give this movie change a 10 out of 10. It's clearly a change that was made for comedic effect, and it's worth noting that in the books, the glass doesn't actually reappear. It stays vanished. In the movies, it comes right back and it traps Dudley there. Hermione insults. Within the series, there seems to be no worse slur than calling someone a mudblood. I've seen countless Reddit threads where people seem to self-censor even their text to not include the word. I'm not really sure if this is just playing into the fantasy world or not. It's always seemed a little bit juvenile to me. Sure, it's a bad thing to call someone, and there are parallels to the real world, but it's still a term talking about if you came from a wizard or muggle family line. It's not really based in reality. I know people are going to be mad about this, so let's just keep going. To be clear, it's a bad thing within the context of Harry Potter. Outside of that, it's kind of inconsequential. I'd rather be focused on actual discrimination, not witch and wizard discrimination. Regardless, in the Chamber of Secrets, we get one of our first exposures to the word. Draco calls Hermione a mudblood, and the scenes that follow split off between the books and the movies. In both, Ron tries to stick up for Hermione, casting a spell at Malfoy, but ends up eating slugs himself, or rather, puking them up. But in the novels, it's Ron who explains the term to Harry, and crucially, explains it to Hermione as well. She seems to not be quite as affected by the slur, and even tries to reclaim it for herself, something Ron doesn't agree with. In the movies, Ron instead spends his time puking into a bucket, while Hagrid explains the term to Harry. The main difference here, though, is that Hermione already knows about the word and its meaning, which is a bit strange considering she would have not been very ingrained in the wizarding world at that point. Similarly to Harry, she wouldn't have much of a reason to know what the word means, let alone to be so affected by it. I'm not really sure what the purpose behind this change would have been. One reason might tie back to the beginning of this video, and it's just one more example of Ron's character being robbed of his lines and value. This reason is to me the most annoying because I think its effect is a little insidious. By removing this line from Ron, we're removing a bit of his character. No longer do we get to see him as someone who does not share the pureblood mentality of the Malfoys of the world, even though he is, by all accounts, from a pureblood wizarding family. It robs the viewer of a chance to better dissect the politics of the wizarding world and see that there are real divides over these ideologies. Instead, we're just left sitting on the sidelines with a puking Ron next to us while Hagrid explains everything. Chosen One Prophecy. This topic seems to make its way into most videos, but I think that gets at how interesting this part of the plot was. Not only does it take away some of the uncertainty from Harry's arc, but it also removes some of the intrigue around Neville's character. Here's the scene from the book directly after Sybil has orated the prophecy, and Harry asks if it was talking about him. Dumbledore responds, quote, "The odd thing is, Harry," he said softly, "that it may not have meant you at all. Sybil's prophecy could have applied to 2 wizard boys, both born at the end of July that year, both of whom had parents in the Order of the Phoenix, both sets of parents having narrowly escaped Voldemort 3 times. One, of course, was you, the other was Neville Longbottom." End quote. This whole scene is narrated out and clearly both brings up and answers the question of whether or not Neville could be the Chosen One. And even though this question is brought up and dismissed rather quickly in the books, the fact that it isn't even brought up at all in the movies is, I think, a disservice to Neville. It seemed to me that without this possibility, Neville suddenly lost a lot of purpose and direction as a character. He came full circle when he got that slow-mo clip of him cutting the snake's head off, but for a while, he seemed more like an abandoned storyline that didn't have much reason to be there. Maybe that's how Neville himself felt. But I, for one, wish they had left a little more mystery in the movie series, instead of them being so incredibly linear. Voldemort's death. Here is another area that I think the movies chose to do a very strange thing, seemingly for dramatic effect. But in my opinion, it failed at producing that effect. In the final battle between Harry and Voldemort, in the movies, we see Harry fire an Expelliarmus spell at Voldemort. Voldemort obviously fires back with Avada Kedavra. The spells meet in the middle, and we get that false priori incantatum. It's the effect I talked about in the previous video. Harry eventually wins the duel due to an allegiance of the Elder Wand, and Voldemort's spell backfires on him, killing him. However, here's where things differ. In the movies, Voldemort turns into ashes or dust or whatever and floats away in death, kind of like he was Thanos snapped out of existence. But in the books, I think he meets a much more fitting end, as a feeble old man lying on the ground. I'll pick up from the book right as they fire spells at each other. Quote, "Avada Kedavra, Expelliarmus." The bang was like a cannon blast, and the golden flames that erupted between them at the dead center of the circle they had been treading marked the point where the spells collided. Harry saw Voldemort's green jet meet his own spell, saw the Elder Wand fly high, dark against the sunrise, spinning across the enchanted ceiling like the head of Nagini, spinning through the air toward the master it would not kill, who had come to take full possession of it at last. And Harry, with the unerring skill of a seeker, caught the wand in his free hand as Voldemort fell backwards, arms splayed, the slit pupils of his scarlet eyes rolling upward. Tom Riddle hit the floor with a mundane finality, his body feeble and shrunken, the white hands empty, the snake-like face vacant and unknowing. Voldemort was dead, killed by his own rebounding curse, and Harry stood with the 2 wands in his hands, staring down at his enemy's shell. End quote. I don't know. To me, the death of Voldemort is much more satisfying with him ending up as a feeble husk of a creature rather than just disintegrating. It makes his death feel much more final, his nature at that point much more grounded. No longer is he an incredibly powerful magical being. Rather, he's just a shriveled old man with nothing special left about him. I'll stand by the books definitely being better in this instance. No questions about it whatsoever. And with that, you've made it to the end of the iceberg. 5 layers later, and I think we've probably covered only a fraction of what was changed from the books to the movies. But I feel like it was a good portion of the changes that stood out to me the most, and that I thought were some of the more impactful changes. What was your favorite, or maybe your least favorite change that the movies made from the books? Did I list it here, or am I going to have to come back with a whole nother video about more changes that the movies made? If you made it this far and you haven't clicked the subscribe button, please do. Like I said, I'd love to hit 10,000 subscribers soon, and your support means the world to me. If you want to check out other videos I've made, there are a few others talking about Harry Potter lore, misconceptions, and fan theories. I've also got videos about Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and Pokemon, and I'm sure I'll be adding more in the future. Let me know in the comments if there's a topic you want me to explore next, and with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.